I sold my company for $50 million and took my son and his wife to the finest restaurant in the city to celebrate. I thought we were marking an ending. I didn't know we were opening a door I'd spent years pretending didn't exist. My name is Silas Merrin. I'm 63. Texas raised the man behind Merrin Freight Systems, a logistics firm I built from one second-hand truck and a borrowed line of credit. I've learned the slow way that success is just discipline repeated, and that love, when you're not careful, turns into trust you never audit. These days I live in Austin. My son Dorian and his wife Marissa live too close for mystery and too far for honesty. This is the night the distance finally told the truth. Spring rain had rinsed the city clean. The silver palm glowed like a promise behind a veil of wet glass, the kind of place where you hear your shoes in the marble and the waiters move like they're part of the music. Candlelight softened every angle. The air carried steak smoke and rosemary, a little butter, a little brag. 3 glasses of Bordeaux sat on linen as white as a hospital sheet. Dorian's favorite. He used to say real wine only comes from France, as if saying it out loud might make it more true. He looked like a magazine ad for a rival white shirt, pressed flat cufflinks catching the light, a watch that wanted to be noticed. He held his hands together at the edge of the table, like a man trying to convince his nerves they belonged to him. Marissa crossed one leg over the other, so the heel flashed and the silk sleeve slid. She laughed with her face more than her eyes, and told a story about a charity gala in Dallas, how the donor wall was all the same names you read in the papers. She said the word investor the way other people say miracle. I smiled and drank water. Somewhere inside the room, a saxophone found the exact note that makes you remember a life you didn't live. I had sat at this same table years ago with Eleanor, my wife, celebrating 30 years of surviving and choosing each other anyway. She wore a deep blue dress and leaned in to say that life only means something if you know when to stop. I didn't understand her then. Tonight I did. I'd stopped. I'd sold my life's work to Northbridge Holdings before noon. By evening, the wire had cleared. I was officially a man with time and a ledger full of blank lines. Dad Dorian said, and the word carried both pride and a plea. I can't believe you actually did it. I thought you'd hold on to the company till the very end. The end's still a long way off, I told him slow and steady. But it's time for someone else to carry the load. Marissa leaned in, voice warm, the way a lamp is warm. Now you can rest, travel, enjoy your life. And of course your son can help you manage what's left. What's left. 2 small words that scraped something old and stubborn inside my chest. The room didn't change, but it felt different. Like a house where a window has been open all night, and you only just noticed the cold. The waiter came back then, young, calm, brown skin, careful hands. His name tag read Julian, and his eyes were the kind that took in a scene the way a dock foreman counts containers. He poured my wine, tipped the bottle, and lowered his voice to a place that barely existed. "Don't drink that," he said. "Your son just did something to your glass." My hand stopped an inch above the stem. He straightened with the neutrality of a confession booth and drifted away, already invisible. The candle trembled. Somewhere behind me, a table laughed too loud and then apologized for it. I looked at the 3 glasses as if I were reading instruments on a failing plane. I reached to adjust my napkin. Linen sighed under my fingers. Marissa turned to greet someone 2 tables over. Dorian glanced down at his phone, the little electric glow of modern attention. I moved my glass into his place and brought his into mine the way a man corrects a crooked frame in his own hallway. Small, exact, unnoticed. He started talking about a clean energy venture that had a name built to impress and a timeline that required faith. He said my support would be the boulder at the top of the hill that finally decided to roll. Marissa watched me with a sweetness that had metal toward the back of it. I felt the clock above the bar tick with the patience of a judge. The sommelier hovered with a list full of words that make other men feel important. Not yet, I told him without looking up. We'll decide later. He left the bottle in a cradle like an infant at a church door. Dorian lifted his glass. To you, Dad. To 4 decades of doing it the right way. You finally gave yourself what you deserve. I touched the rim of my glass to his. The sound was delicate and strangely hopeful. He drank deep. I didn't. 5 seconds. 10. The band slid into something softer. Forks met plates. Conversation rose and fell like tide against pilings. I watched my son's face the way a mechanic watches a gauge. His smile stuttered. His hand went to his temple. A breath snagged. Color narrowed. Marissa stood so fast the chair legs barked. Help, she said to the room, and then again louder so the performance could hear itself. Help him. Please. Dorian braced on the table. The wine rolled and fell. Red spread across the white like a wound learning its shape. I stayed still. When you spend 40 years in freight, you learn how to watch a crisis without becoming one. Julian appeared behind the bar, not moving until I found his eyes. I nodded once. Keep that glass, I said when he leaned in, voice smaller than the space between us. Send it to Davis Labs. Don't speak to anyone about it. He took the instruction the way a harbor takes weather, and was gone. The room arranged itself around the emergency. A manager with a calm voice, a busser with paper towels that would never be enough, someone dialing 3 numbers like a prayer. The door opened to siren noise that came and went, the way we imagine danger when it isn't ours. They helped my son out the door. Marissa clung to him, tears fast and shiny, as if fear were a role with lines she'd rehearsed. The space he left behind looked wrong, like a tooth pulled from a smile. I stayed. My glass caught the candle and turned the wine almost black. For a moment I could see my reflection in it, and it looked like a man I almost recognized. I took out my phone and wrote 1 line to my attorney. Calder Reeves. Something's happened. See me in the morning. I hit send and set the phone face down as if it could hear me breathing. The stain on the cloth deepened, edges feathering. A busser approached, and then thought better of it. The rain found the window again, tiny points of light sliding down into themselves. The band kept playing because that's what bands are paid to do. There's a quiet that comes to a man when he runs out of excuses for what love has allowed. I felt it settle in my chest, heavy and clean. I remembered Eleanor, her hand on mine, her voice saying, life only holds its meaning if you know when to stop. I wondered if she'd known I would need those words tonight, if the past can send a rope to the future, and call it mercy. Trust, once broken, never keeps its old shape. The sentence arrived without my permission and sat down like a guest. I didn't argue with it. I stood, slipped on my coat, tucked a tip under the fold of the check that meant nothing and everything at once. The door let me out into rain that felt like it had been waiting for me. Behind me, the siren grew louder until it didn't, and the city resumed the business of pretending. I walked to my car with the kind of calm that follows a decision. The celebration was over. The audit had begun. I walked straight into the parking lot without looking back. Not out of bravery, but because if I stopped for even 1 second, I might turn around and hold the son who'd nearly died from the same glass meant to kill his father. The air was damp and sharp, thick with the scent of wet asphalt and the metallic breath of rain. I scrolled through my contacts, found Julian's number from the receipt, and told him to meet me at the employee entrance. He appeared a few minutes later, still wearing his apron, eyes darting as if the walls had ears. I said the wine glass had to be preserved for testing. He nodded, said he'd already moved it to the service storage room away from the bar. I instructed him to seal it in a sterile bag, use new gloves, and write his name and the exact time on the label. He listened carefully, then ran back inside. The restaurant manager followed soon after, his face drawn tight. He asked if there was going to be legal trouble if the restaurant would be held responsible. I told him calmly that I only wanted to make sure everything was handled properly, that I wasn't here to assign blame before knowing the truth. I mentioned Davis Laboratories, the same lab I'd used years ago for food safety audits when Merrin Freight Systems was still running. The manager seemed relieved at the familiarity of the name. He led me into a small office behind the kitchen white light buzzing overhead. Julian returned carrying a sample box inside it, my half-full Bordeaux glass glimmering dark and viscous under the light. He showed me the label, his name, the time, table 12. I nodded and signed the simple acknowledgement form printed off a nearby computer. I told them I'd arrange for pickup immediately. The ambulance siren outside fractured once, then faded into the distance. I thanked them both and told Julian quietly that he'd done the right thing and that I'd remember it. In the truck, I called Carol from Davis Labs, a woman in her late 50s, whose voice always carried the weight of precision. I told her there was a sealed sample waiting at the Silver Palm, that I needed toxicology for benzodiazepines and foreign agents priority on diazepam. She said she'd send a courier within 30 minutes. I gave her my old Merrin Freight client ID, a relic from a life when paper trails were second nature, even in the dark. I texted her a photo of the seal for verification. Only then did I start the engine. St. David's Hospital wasn't far, but rain turned the roads into glass. I drove slow, my hands gripping the wheel tight. A single thought kept looping without shape or name. It was time to stop letting anyone else decide my life for me. Inside the ER, the smell of antiseptic was heavy. Marissa stood against the wall, mascara bleeding down like soot. When she saw me, she rushed over saying Dorian couldn't breathe, that it was just stress, nothing more. I heard my own voice answer, calm, distant, that the doctors would tell us what we needed to know. A nurse called the family name and led us into a small consultation room. Dr. May Holloway entered, clipboard in hand. She was composed, her hair pinned high, eyes steady and warm. She said the preliminary tests showed signs of diazepam poisoning in Dorian's blood, a high dose, but they'd administered an antagonist and stabilized him. Then she added that by regulation, suspected ingestion of a substance meant the hospital had to notify law enforcement. Marissa gasped, said Dorian had only been drinking wine, that there must be some mistake. I turned to the doctor and said I wanted the results kept confidential until our family understood what had happened, that I didn't want to destroy my son's life, at least not yet. I wasn't pleading. I was stating a fact. Doctor. Holloway looked at me a moment longer than she had, to then said the incident would still be documented, but that she would hold off on contacting authorities if we guaranteed the patient's safety and cooperated with any later requests. I said we would. Outside, Marissa tugged at my sleeve and asked if I suspected anyone. I told her this wasn't the time for guesses, that Dorian's stability was the only priority. Dr. Holloway soon returned and said he was out of danger. Still groggy, would need overnight monitoring. I thanked her for her candor. As we stepped into the corridor, Marissa began talking about suing the restaurant for serving contaminated wine. I told her we'd discuss it in the morning. My tone was quiet, but sharp enough to stop her. I stood by the glass doors, watching the rain draw restless streaks across the parking lot. Inside, nurses wheeled gurneys that looked like white shadows passing each other without sound. Sometimes hospitals feel like moral train stations, people arriving at decisions that will follow them for the rest of their lives. Stay or leave. Confess or stay silent. I thought of Eleanor. She used to say kindness isn't blindness, that real gentleness means knowing where to draw the line. I took a breath and called Carol again. She confirmed the courier had picked up the sample. The seal intact, preliminary results, expected soon full-spectrum analysis in a few days. I thanked her and asked that my name be kept out of all communication, that any contact go through my attorney's office. She agreed, her voice low and solid. I sat in the waiting area with a cup of hospital coffee. Its smell thin and overused, like memories watered down. The clock barely moved. I texted Calder Reeves, my lawyer. Something's begun. This time I'll finish it properly. He read it almost immediately. 2 words came back. Understood. Tomorrow. Around midnight, a nurse told me Dorian was drifting in and out, still weak. I stood at the doorway of his room, watching my son under the white hum of fluorescent light wires tracing the rhythm of his breath. Marissa sat nearby, head against the wall, her phone glowing like a small confession. I didn't go in. I didn't have it in me to meet his eyes when they opened. Not when the question hanging between us was one no father should ever have to answer. Who tried to poison whom I stayed for a moment, then left. Outside, the rain had softened each drop, tapping the hood of my truck with the patience of a metronome. I sat behind the wheel until my fingers went numb, thinking of the road ahead and the evidence trail I would build, clean, legal, unshakable, strong enough to stand against any attorney in the state. The glass was at the lab. The hospital had the records. I'd delayed the police, but that grace would not last. Tomorrow I'd do what I do best, plan, fortify, and let the truth speak for itself. I turned the key. The radio came alive halfway through an old blues song, the singer's voice rough as sandpaper, tired, but certain. The highway shimmered like a wet ribbon under the streetlights. Brake lights blinked in the distance, on and off like a coded signal only truckers could read. At a curve, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back wasn't older than 63, because of years, but because it had finally stopped waiting for anyone to come back unchanged. The morning broke clean after the rain, the air in the garden thick with the smell of wet wood and turned earth. I made my coffee, black, no sugar, no cream, and drank it in silence. Starting the day the way an auditor begins his final report on a life he once thought balanced. The house sat 15 minutes outside Austin, quiet and wind-sheltered, a place I'd once imagined I'd end my days. Now it felt less like a home, and more like the scene of an investigation. On the mantel still stood Eleanor's photograph, autumn of 2018, a few months before the cancer took her. She was sitting in the garden holding a teacup, smiling the kind of smile that made you believe storms could be reasoned with. I touched the wooden frame. Dust clung to my fingertips. When I lost her, I lost half my patience with the world. The rest, I was losing now. The phone vibrated. Calder Reeves arrived on time as always. I opened the door to find him in a gray suit leather briefcase in hand, face of a man who keeps evidence where others keep emotion. He said nothing at first, just placed a folder on the table. I need to confirm something, I told him, opening my laptop, scrolling through the archived financial records of Merrin Freight Systems, the mirror image of what I'd handed to Northbridge Holdings. Every former employee's access had been revoked, except a few from senior finance. Dorian's name was one of them. Calder leaned back, fingers steepled. He said the state of Texas had very clear statutes about elder financial exploitation, and that most cases began with people closest to home. Do you think my son's exploiting that access? I asked. I don't draw conclusions, he said, but the first step is to review all transactions from the 6 months before the sale closed. I nodded, opened my archived emails, and began scanning line by line. Small transfers first, a few thousand, then tens of thousands. Then in February, 2 large payments, nearly $400,000, to a private firm in Houston. I had never authorized them. Dorian, as CFO, had once had authority for project advances, but that access should have ended the moment the deal closed. I printed the statement and marked each line in red. Calder read it silently, his brow tightening. Could anyone else have used the credentials, he asked. Only one person had the old password. And token, I said. My son. He exhaled through his nose, reached into his briefcase, and slid across a copy of Texas Penal Code 32.53, Misappropriation of Elder Assets. The phrase elder exploitation looked like a verdict waiting for my name. I didn't feel anger, only the recognition of a truth no one wanted to admit. When Calder left, I stayed in my study, the light slanting through the blinds in narrow stripes. In the corner stood a box of Eleanor's old teaching files from her years at the high school. She used to say Dorian had my memory, but none of my patience. I pulled open a drawer and took out a black notebook. I wrote a list in careful print check, sub-accounts review, savings, ledgers, reset security codes, lock bank access, verify the trust accounts. Each line I wrote was a brick in the wall I was rebuilding from the rubble of trust. Lunch was a cold sandwich and colder coffee. I replayed an old voice memo, Dorian, back when he was CFO. His voice young, confident, promising to protect the legacy to keep Merrin Freight Systems a symbol of integrity. I played it 3 times, then deleted it. Not out of anger, but because I refused to build a new war on the bones of old promises. That afternoon, Calder emailed a list of legal contacts at Northbridge for verification. I called. The compliance officer confirmed that Dorian's administrator access had remained active for 1 week after the official sale closure. 1 week enough time to move money clean tracks and plant ghosts. I noted it in the notebook. By evening, the porch lights came on automatically. I opened a bottle of Eleanor's old whiskey, the one she'd kept for special occasions, and poured an inch into a glass. I didn't drink it. I just watched the pale gold shimmer in the low light. I remembered the first night Dorian joined the company. He was 22 sleeves too long, asking to learn the business for real. I'd taught him everything: how to read cash flow reports, how to treat employees like family. Once he'd said something that made me proud. Someday I'll carry your name, Dad, and I'll do it right. Those words felt hollow now, like the echo of a house long abandoned. My phone chimed. An email from Davis Labs. Preliminary results. The sample contained diazepam 5 times the standard sedative dosage. I read the report line by line, expressionless. The air thickened in the room until it felt like the walls were breathing. Every piece fit. There was no room left for doubt. I printed the results, slid them into a folder beside Dorian's financial statements. Outside, the crickets began their nightly chorus. I turned off the lamp and looked once more at Eleanor's photograph. If you were here, I thought maybe I wouldn't feel this alone. But I knew this wasn't a family matter anymore. It was a new map, one, where every border would have to be drawn by law, not by love. Before bed, I shut down the computer, opened the safe, and sealed the documents in a thick envelope. I wrote on the label by hand, Calder Reeves, confidential. Locked the safe, pocketed the key. Then I sat down again, opened the notebook, and added one more line, the handwriting shaking but legible. I once thought trust was a gift. Turns out it's the perfect trap. When I closed the book, the clock read 11:30. The wind tapped lightly against the window, then fell silent. I stayed there a while longer, hand resting on the cover, until the desk lamp dimmed into the slow, steady breathing of the dark. I woke before dawn, opened the window, and let the cold air pour in. Then I sat at my desk like an archivist reopening boxes he once swore he'd never touch again. When the first light brushed across the cover of my notebook, a fragment of the past rose up on its own. Austin, 2021. The air was dry enough to crack paper. Dorian had just walked out of his rented office on South Congress, clutching an old laptop the way a drowning man clings to a leaking life raft. His clean energy startup had collapsed after 2 failed funding rounds. Investors pulled out, contracts died, and all that remained was a spreadsheet of cold numbers: $2.4 million owed to suppliers, engineers, unpaid, a prototype solar grid gathering dust on the roof of a warehouse in Bastrop. That afternoon, he came to see me in the garage, pride hiding behind exhaustion. He said he was fine. He just needed time. I looked at the invoices in his hand and knew time doesn't negotiate with interest rates. Marissa was working PR for a cosmetics brand back then, until the pandemic gutted her department. She came home with a cardboard box filled with framed gala photos and expired business cards, relics from a life that had moved on without her. I used to hear them arguing through the paper-thin walls of their Riverside apartment. About rent, about the car loan, about rolling over debt on credit cards. And then, as if by instinct, the conversation turned to me, to the right, to benefit from what a father had built. That phrase stuck like a splinter. The right to benefit. It became their mantra of convenience. I remember standing on the balcony that evening, watching the sun blur into the river, feeling a small fracture form somewhere beneath my ribs. I helped once. A consulting advance on paper, fully documented, approved by my accountant. The condition was clear: a repayment plan within 6 months, accounts closed and clean. 6 months passed, the way a closed shop keeps its lights on for ghosts. Dorian sold what he could, paid the staff he owed, but the debt stayed cold and unmoving. They moved into my guest house for a while to save money. I thought it was a pause before recovery. It was the first step down a slower kind of fall. These memories aren't born from resentment. They're facts I can touch. In my desk drawer, I still keep copies of their lease termination supplier letters from Round Rock demanding payment, even a yellow sticky note in Marissa's handwriting, a reminder for a canceled investor meeting that December. I opened my laptop and scrolled through an old inbox. There it was, a 2021 thread between Dorian and a small legal service in Westlake. Subject line: personal financial restructuring and emergency medical proxy. I hadn't paid attention back then. I thought my son was rebuilding. Reading it now, I saw an attached calendar invite coffee meeting on Lamar Boulevard with a name I didn't recognize. A junior associate listed under a family document firm. I wrote it down in my notebook. Further down, a message from Marissa: "We need to make everything look cleaner." That word cleaner made me laugh too late. By then, Marissa had no job, but still carried herself like she was on a panel. She could hold eye contact without blinking. In her notes, she'd written about a legal pathway to help her father-in-law manage his affairs responsibly after an emergency. A durable power of attorney. One signature, and every financial account, investment, and property could be managed or moved on my behalf. She called it family responsibility. I could hear the polish of that phrasing even now, slick and precise. Someone might ask how a father could miss the signs. The truth is, I saw them each one, but I wanted to believe hardship might teach them humility. Late that year, Dorian left me a voicemail saying he'd take care of everything that I wouldn't have to worry. The sound of his voice fooled me. What I didn't hear was the whisper behind it, the temporary plan, the pride rebranding dependence as strategy. Scrolling further, I found scanned drafts, a medical proxy, and a financial authorization form, both undated, both unsigned by me. The intended primary agent was Dorian. Alternate Marissa. The instructions even suggested a warm opening paragraph expressing the father's wish to be cared for by family in case of emergency. I leaned back. Those neutral words looked like a net woven from legal silk. I remembered one night that winter when Dorian came by, eyes hollow. He asked me to transfer the deed to the guest house, said it would help him secure a temporary loan just until his next project stabilized. I said no. He went silent and never brought it up again. I thought I'd put out the spark. Turns out the fire just moved underground, burning slow through paperwork I never read. By afternoon, sunlight slanted across the porch, the floorboards warmed under my feet. I thought about another scene, not from the past, but from weeks ago, one I'd pieced together from stray calendar invites and credit card records. Marissa met that same young lawyer again, earlier this year, just weeks before I sold Merrin Freight. This time the meeting wasn't at a coffee shop, it was a rented conference room in Tarrytown. On the same day they paid for a mobile notary service. The plan had changed. It wasn't about rebuilding after failure anymore. It was about building a bridge straight into my safe. In my mind, I could hear Marissa's voice, the same tone I'd grown to recognize smooth as silk over steel. She'd talk about concern for my health, about the vulnerability of being 63, about the need for a representative to handle affairs. Then she'd slide the document across the table toward Dorian. All he has to do is sign. It's for his own good. I could almost hear his hesitation, the softness of the boy who once stood in my garage, watching me wipe grease off an engine block. He'd ask if it was the right thing to do, and the chill would come in Marissa's answer. "You're his only son. No one would believe him anyway if he's declared incompetent. We're protecting the family's assets. I know this not because I was listening behind a door, but because I've learned to read the ghosts they leave behind." Draft files, deleted messages, canceled appointments. The invoice from that notary service came with a note, "Meeting postponed, missing signature." They hadn't finished the job. But the intent was there, sharp as glass. Back in my office, I opened the safe and took out the envelope prepared for Calder. I added a printout of that meeting invite, a summary of their late-year expenses, and a handwritten note, just 3 lines, 2021. Debt, 2.4 MN. PR, job lost. The right to benefit, renamed family duty. I sealed it. Then I wondered what could still be saved. Not money. Money comes with its own laws. What needed saving was the meaning of legacy, what Dorian once said he'd inherit. If legacy is just a number in a ledger, it's a bridge easily rerouted. But if it's a habit, a boundary, a map of self-respect, it needs to be rewritten in a language no one can forge. I locked the safe, pocketed the key, and turned off the light. Night settled softly like an invoice slipped under a door. I sat on the porch steps, listening to the crickets hum across the lawn. In the dark, the memories of 2021 fit neatly into the present two pieces of wood, sanded smooth until their seam disappeared. I rose, went inside, and placed the envelope on the desk right where the first light would find it when morning returned. The sun had just cleared the oaks when my phone buzzed. Seraphine Cho texted that she was nearby, asking if we could meet at a short-term office space on Bee Cave Road. I replied, yes, grabbed my coat, locked the envelope back into the safe, and drove out through the gates. The office she'd rented was on the second floor of a red brick building that smelled faintly of printer ink and linseed oil. She was waiting at the door, composed alert, the kind of calm you only learn from staring through other people's lies. She didn't waste time. She opened her tablet and asked me to recount everything in order the unexplained transfers, the lab results, the night at the restaurant. I spoke slowly, pinning each fact to a date and a place. When I finished, she nodded once. She said that under Texas law, people my age were protected from elder financial exploitation, but the first step was always evidence, legal evidence. I asked what she needed. She said as the homeowner, I had full right to install cameras in shared areas, the living room, kitchen, hallways, the front yard. No private rooms. Each feed would upload to cloud storage in my name. She recommended a doorbell with an integrated mic and a wall clock with a hidden sensor. I agreed. She told me to live as usual, keep my schedule, show no suspicion. Normalcy, she said, is the curtain that lets the lenses do their work. We scheduled the installation for that day. She called in 2 technicians. I drove home to open the gate and have my ownership papers ready in case the neighbors asked questions. While they worked, I walked through the house like a visitor. The kitchen hummed with the sound of screwdrivers and a router coming online. A ladder leaned against the bookshelf in the living room. The new wall clock looked identical to the old one, just whiter, cleaner. Seraphine checked each corner, her phone showing 4 frames, 4 angles synced to the second. Audio clear, video crisp. She smiled faintly. The system was alive. When they left, I stood on the porch for a moment. The air smelled of cut grass from next door. Seraphine handed me a thin packet self-check questions she wanted me to answer each night. Who came into the house? What did they say about money or property? Did they mention your mental health? I slipped the packet into a drawer, went upstairs, and brought her the sealed envelope. She said she'd digitize it, store a mirrored copy, and return the original before sundown. That afternoon, I drove downtown to see Calder Reeves. His office overlooked the green line of trees near the Travis County Courthouse. He greeted me with a folder thick as a novel. The first page was a schematic, a new irrevocable trust. He explained that I'd transfer part of my assets into it, forming a separate legal entity managed by a trustee company. I would set the terms, they would execute them. I asked for numbers. He proposed $35 million into the trust, the rest kept liquid. I agreed without hesitation. We drafted the clauses together. Access contingent on proven financial independence. No record of fraud or abuse. No act of harm toward me, physical or legal. Then I added one more line: if any heir attempted or conspired to seize control through manipulation or injury, their share would redirect to a charitable fund. I told him the name. The Eleanor Foundation for Integrity. Calder looked at me, nodded. Said it was a clear message. He suggested a no-contest clause as well. Anyone who challenged the trust would be disinherited. I agreed again. To anyone else, the language would have sounded sterile. To me, each word clicked into place like steel pins holding up a bridge. Calder said he'd have a draft ready in 3 days, final review in 5, then signing before a notary. He printed the schedule, clipped it neatly, and reminded me to speak to no one, not even family. Rain came and went on the drive home, a brief shimmer that left the road on Rancho Viejo gleaming like liquid metal. I remembered driving Eleanor through this same route when we first moved to Austin. She'd taken a photo of the post-rain sky, said it looked like the river back home. I kept that photo in my wallet for years. Tonight, my wallet held only documents. Plans, not prayers. At home, I made a simple soup, ate slow, and sat at my desk. A message from Seraphine arrived, all cameras online, all signals clean. She reminded me silence and patience. At dusk, Dorian texted that he and Marissa would stop by to pick up some old boxes to sell. They came in quietly. Their voices echoed through the ceiling, thin and sharp, like a knife sliding through paper. They opened boxes, sorting trinkets and small electronics. I didn't step out. I let the cameras do what they were made to do. When they left, I turned off the feed, poured a glass of water, and called Seraphine. I told her the night passed quietly. She said that was good. She'd stop by tomorrow to collect the lab invoice for the official record. I agreed, locked the documents away. Outside, the clouds broke open, and the moon slipped out from behind the leaves. It was full night when her first email came through. No subject, just a date and time. Inside, a secure link, two-step authentication. The video loaded. The living room. Low angle. The coffee table a slice of the bookshelf. The timestamp matched late afternoon, right after they'd dropped off the boxes. Audio clean. Paper rustling. Tape stretching. Then Marissa's voice. No sweetness this time, just calculation. She reminded Dorian about the new power of attorney draft. She said they'd need to rewrite the forms, adjust the health status section schedule, the mobile notary. Make it look reasonable, she said, so if anyone asks, the story stands on its own. Dorian's voice came low, unsteady, like a man standing too close to the edge. He said it had gone too far, that the night at the restaurant still felt like a hand around his throat. Marissa cut him off. She told him he was the only son that people expect an aging man to lose clarity after a financial collapse. That if they framed it right, no one would believe what I said. I felt my wrist tighten against the desk, the knuckles whitening under the skin. The video ended as they packed their things and left. I sat still for a long time, listening to the hum of the air conditioner in the dark. Then I saved the file, labeled it under Seraphine's encryption protocol, and uploaded a copy to the secure inbox Calder had built for me. An automatic reply came through. File received. Encrypted. I leaned back, exhaled, feeling my body like a block of wood clamped in a vise, tense, rigid, but perfectly aligned. I woke early, brewed black coffee, and opened the phone to review the 4 camera feeds. The house was still blank, like a sheet of paper waiting for ink. I texted Dorian that dinner would be at home tonight, beef stew and fresh bread. He replied with one word, sure. I added another message saying I wanted to discuss estate management after the company sale, that it was time for the family to speak openly. No emojis, no exclamation marks, just a time and an invitation. In the dining room drawer, I had already arranged a set of papers. On top lay a blank duplicate, a decoy watermarked faintly with the name of a fake law firm Seraphine had marked for identification. It was bait, legally worthless. Beneath it rested the genuine draft I expected them to bring, replicated line for line, ready for the moment my pen touched down. I checked the cameras again. The microphone inside the wall clock caught even the tap of a spoon. The doorbell sensor recorded motion and sound. I spoke a few test words. The playback caught every breath. Headlights turned into the driveway. Dorian driving, Marissa beside him, a new diamond bracelet glinting under her sleeve. When they stepped inside, her perfume drifted through the door like sweet smoke. Dorian said I looked better tonight. Marissa said the house felt warm, and the stew smelled wonderful. I invited them to sit. We ate the first few minutes in a kind of peace that didn't have roots. Then I broke the silence. If you want to help me manage the assets, I said, tell me honestly what you're thinking. Dorian looked at her, then at me. He said that after a major sale structure was important, that at my age I should have someone trustworthy overseeing paperwork. Marissa unzipped her bag, pulled out a clipped stack of forms. She said it was a combined financial and medical power of attorney standard procedure widely used. One signature, and it would simplify hospital payments, tax filings, emergencies. Her voice was soft butter melting on warm bread. I nodded slowly. I told them I didn't oppose their help, only that everything must be transparent. I motioned for her to place the papers on the table. Dorian said we could sign tonight, 5 minutes at most. I said before signing anything I always read. I flipped the cover page. The law firm's name, the durable authority section, the witness lines still blank. I asked if they had a notary present. Marissa said not tonight, tomorrow for formal verification. I nodded, set the papers down, looked at both of them, and said quietly that if they wanted their father's trust, then they should let me trust them. I pulled open the drawer, took out my file, and slid the decoy on top of theirs, hiding the faint watermark only Seraphine and I would recognize. I straightened the stack, reached for the Mont Blanc pen Eleanor had given me on our 25th anniversary. The cap clicked softly like a lock turning. I signed Silas Merrin in the space they believed was real. The stroke was calm, deliberate, perfectly visible to the camera above. I placed the pen down and pushed the papers across the table. Dorian leaned forward, eyes flickering with relief and something like confusion. Marissa's glance was quick, professional. She closed the folder and slid it into her bag as neatly as a magician hiding a card. I ladled more stew. I told a story from my old trucking days. Winter runs engines freezing on the mountain passes. Dorian forced a laugh, said he'd learn to change oil someday. Marissa asked whether I'd sold the southern warehouse. Not yet, I said, still waiting on an appraisal. Dinner moved like a rehearsed play, every line delivered on cue. I stood to clear the plates, letting them sit in their composure. The kitchen camera caught the sound of water and clinking metal, but the dining room mic caught something closer, the rhythm of breath. I let the sound do its work. When I came back with a plate of fruit, I thanked them for being direct. Dorian nodded, said this decision would make things easier for everyone. Marissa rose with her bag, said she'd call the notary in the morning. I smiled, said fine, whatever works. I walked them to the door. Night wind carried the scent of distant rain. The doorbell light blinked softly as the sensor came alive. Dorian said he might stop by early tomorrow. I told him I had errands come after lunch. He nodded. Marissa leaned toward him as they reached the car, her voice barely above a whisper. At last he signed, she said. The final word dissolved sweet and thin like sugar in warm water. I stood on the porch, hand on the doorknob, letting the silence stretch until their tail lights vanished. Then I went straight to the study. I opened the surveillance app, scrolled to the front door timestamp. Tires on gravel. Marissa's voice, a clean, sharp thread. At last he signed. I marked the clip, labeled it by date and time, trimmed a shorter segment, her whisper, and my signature. Then I attached it to a secure email addressed to Seraphine and Calder. Subject line: tonight's recording, verify and authenticate sequence. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated. Seraphine received. Audio clear. Signal clean. Forensic copy in process. Chain of custody hash initiated. Calder: do nothing further tonight. Keep within the vault. Meeting at 9. I sat back, thinking of that pen stroke the moment my hand fell exactly where they wanted, but on the paper I chose. Tomorrow the notary would arrive and receive a polite refusal. The real documents would already belong to my attorney. The no contest clause waiting in Calder's draft would make sure of that. Upstairs I paused before Eleanor's photograph. I didn't speak. I just placed my hand on the wooden frame, feeling the smooth grain, like the calm of an old habit that had saved me more than once. Back in the study, I opened my notebook and wrote 3 lines, signed the blank copy. They confirmed it aloud. Audio and video links complete. I closed the notebook, blew out the desk lamp, and lay still in the quiet night of Austin. My body was tired but steady. Outside, a bat swept past the window, leaving a pocket of emptiness in the air. I closed my eyes, keeping my breath even. Tomorrow, everything would keep moving forward at the pace I chose. The morning opened with the sound of a distant train horn and the thick scent of coffee. I was up before dawn, driving straight into downtown Congress Avenue, still half asleep, the glass towers catching the first slice of light. Calder's office sat on the 14th floor. When the elevator doors opened, his assistant was already waiting with a checklist of materials. The conference room was glass-walled, quiet whiteboards, sliding along the sides a large screen, waiting to sync with Seraphine's laptop. Calder placed a gray folder in front of me. His tone was steady. Today, we build the timeline lock, the chain of custody, follow the rule of preservation. Seraphine arrived moments later, hair pulled tight, a trace of morning dew on her coat. She set a sealed evidence box on the table, the tag stamped with a hash code and time stamp. Inside was the wine glass Julian Cross had bagged the night before and handed to me, and that I'd passed to Seraphine before midnight. We began with what was clear. The Silver Palm camera captured the pour at 8:17. My phone log showed the call that pulled me from the table. In the next frame, Julian stood a step away, and Marissa's hand brushed the rim of my glass. Seraphine froze the frame. Enlarged the faint ripple of liquid trembling under the light. She unsealed the box, slipped the glass into a second sterile bag, and placed it on the tray of her mobile forensics unit parked below in the garage. She said they'd run spectral analysis for residue, then lift prints with nylon powder and adhesive film. I didn't ask questions. At my age, the science matters less than the protocol, the proof that someone was careful enough to remember the truth. Calder wrote the first lines on the board, the Silver Palm, 8:17 pour. 8:24. Subject leaves table. 8:25 to 8:27. Suspicious contact. 8:41. Physiological reaction observed in Dorian. I recounted what I'd heard, the whisper from Julian, the glass switch, the color draining from my son's face like someone had opened a window where no glass remained. Calder noted everything, even my pauses, as if each breath were data to be archived. He said he'd get Julian's sworn statement by afternoon. I reminded him to keep the man protected, no blame shifted by the restaurant. 40 minutes later, Seraphine returned with 3 preliminary results. The largest fingerprint on the stem matched Marissa's lifted from her phone camera lens, which the restaurant feed had caught her nudging aside. The second belonged to me on the base. Trace diazepam detected in the dried wine ring along the rim. Calder read the printout without stopping. The paper was still warm from the lab's printer. He pinned it to the corner of the whiteboard under a red tag marked Physical Evidence. Then came the finances. I opened my laptop, granted Seraphine access to Lone Star Bank, where Dorian and I had shared secondary cards when he was CFO. She filtered transactions by 3 criteria: Dorian's subcard, Marissa's, and any purchase outside Austin within the last 52 weeks. The map lit up black dots spreading across Texas, then branching into other states. 3 large purchases in Dallas late last year, 2 in Scottsdale, 4 in Las Vegas, a transfer to what looked like a car dealership in Round Rock. I pictured their new SUV gleaming in the driveway. Dorian had said it was rented. The payment matched a deposit. Calder asked for a full export-type date-time location, then cross-referenced them with the date Dorian's startup had declared bankruptcy 2 springs ago. Seraphine pulled up my old email logs, checking when I'd revoked Dorian's admin access. Between the lines, she found a 48-hour window after the bankruptcy filing 1 unauthorized login from their old apartment's IP. I remembered teaching him bookkeeping when he was 12. How a single number out of place could pull a whole column down. I said quietly that when your child turns you into the mark, a father has no choice but to become his own lawyer. Calder paused his pen, then wrote the sentence down, as if even that belonged in the record. Seraphine stepped out to call a contact at the bank, someone who could confirm an internal subtrust account used as a bridge loan shell. When she came back, her expression had changed, focused, sharp. There was an auxiliary account under Dorian's tax profile opened late that year. 3 deposits, $150,000, $100,000, $150,000, $400,000 in total, emptied within 30 days. Withdrawal points aligned with the Dallas and Vegas purchases and the dealership payment. The bank's internal notes flagged the user as subcard holder, not the primary. The room went still. Only the sound of the AC, a thin, precise hiss, filled the space. Calder drew a red underline beneath 3 words, subaccount. 400K. Startup collapse. He said this would anchor the Elder financial exploitation claim, combined with the coerced power of attorney attempt and the diazepam incident. It would support both protective order and temporary asset freeze. He told Seraphine to finalize the forensic report with login logs, IP addresses, and normalized transaction tables. Then Seraphine played back the clip from last night, the whisper outside the porch. At last, he signed. The words fell perfectly between 2 timestamps on the board, a nail pinning the narrative to the wall. Calder said there'd be 3 copies, 1 read-only drive in his firm's vault, 1 in the bank's safe deposit box, and 1 in cold storage. I nodded quietly, reciting my own vault address on Guadalupe Street. No one mentioned food when noon passed. The assistant knocked once and left 3 bottles of water. I drank half, felt the cool slide down, then the heat rise again like running uphill. Calder said by late afternoon he'd file for temporary account restrictions and contact the Travis County Sheriff's Office about the restaurant incident. I told him I didn't want handcuffs, not for anger's sake. He replied that law had no emotion, only order. And the order today, he said, was to protect, collect, and lock every door that opened with the wrong key. Seraphine closed her laptop, saying the lab had received the sample and would issue a certified report within 24 hours signed by an independent analyst. She showed me the draft chain of custody sheet Julian to me to her time, sealed ambient temperature photo evidence. Every transfer, every minute accounted for. By late afternoon, the table was cleared and color-coded folders stacked neatly. Only 2 things remained: Eleanor's pen and a note Calder had written by hand. He reminded me to change all passwords today, close every subcard, and move valuables to the vault. I added my own list. Dorian's license plate, the dealership name Julian's meeting time, the notary appointment tomorrow morning where nothing would be signed without my lawyer. When I stepped out of the elevator, Austin's sun hit the glass sidewalks like a field of shattered mirrors. I stood in the shadow of a concrete pillar, calling the bank. The voice on the other end was polite, almost tender, as it confirmed the card's immediate closure. Then came the last click, the sound of a lock finding its seat. A text from Seraphine followed a spreadsheet cross-mapping every withdrawal from that hidden account with the startup's invoices before it fell apart. The numbers lined up like courtroom benches, straight cold, unblinking. No room left for doubt. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred in the light. The phone rang just as I stepped off the porch, sharp and sudden, like a fish caught on the hook. Seraphine had sent a link. A local Austin outlet had broken the story. The headline stretched across the screen in bold letters. Former businessman accuses his son of asset conspiracy. Below it, a photo me in the bank parking lot last week, the camera angle stretching my face into something colder than I remembered being. Early summer wind swept through the oaks, carrying the rustle of a newspaper someone had left drifting along the curb. I stood under the eave, reading each line slowly, the taste of metal thick on my tongue. By midday, the local station had picked it up. They aired a short clip Dorian standing on the lawn of his new rental, the sun flaring off the camera lens. He said his father was confused, unstable. He said the family needed privacy, not a public circus. I didn't hear his voice. I only heard the sound of shears slicing through something fragile called trust. Then came Marissa. She stood in the shade, hand gripping her purse strap, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. She said he needs help. Let the doctors and the law do their jobs. Every word fell like rain, engineered to land on cue. By afternoon, unfamiliar cars began to slow near my gate. A black SUV stopped, lingered, then rolled away. Behind the tinted glass, curiosity blinked like a flashbulb. An old neighbor walked by, nodded politely, then looked down as if the pavement had something worth studying. I took 3 calls from men I used to do business with, each voice lined with good intentions, advising silence. The press, they said, rarely gives fairness. I thanked them all, ending each call before they could ask more. Calder called an emergency meeting. Same room, same whiteboard, but now with a new list. First wave, he said, tapping his pen, is reputation assault. They'll frame you as a senior, losing cognitive grip. He continued calmly. They'll spin it as post-sale depression, empty nest syndrome, a man unraveling after success. I sat upright and said, then tell them I still wake at 5 and make my own coffee. Calder didn't smile. He said we needed a media perimeter even if the real battle was in court. He'd retained a crisis management consultant to monitor my mentions online, and he'd file a motion restricting inflammatory statements from the defense to prevent jury contamination. Seraphine added her plan: any press inquiries go through Calder's assistant, who'd give the same 3 words: no comment pending legal process. I nodded. There was power in that simplicity. No comment could weigh more than 100 justifications. By late afternoon, I stopped by the Eleanor Foundation office on Brazos Street to sign the papers transferring investment returns into the Fall Scholarship Fund. The program manager looked at me with the distracted kindness of someone juggling too many names for too little space. She asked if everything was all right. I said the foundation was steady, and the rest was between me and the law. On the wall behind her, A photo of Eleanor smiled frozen in sunlight during that picnic at Pedernales years ago. I stood there longer than I needed to, then signed and left. That evening, Seraphine sent her tracking report. Anonymous accounts were pushing narratives of a bitter father. Others were reposting old award photos of Dorian and me, cropping smiles into tragedy. She advised locking comments on all personal platforms and archiving content against possible fabrication. I did as she said, each click like closing a window on a city growing louder outside. Calder called later, reminding me of the preliminary hearing in 2 days at Travis County Court. He warned that Dorian's team might file for temporary guardianship, citing diminished capacity. He'd already assembled the rebuttal medical records, cognitive evaluations, and my company's operational history through the merger date. I asked if they'd truly go that far. He said they already had. What we were seeing online was just the prelude. I exhaled, feeling the weight settle like another brick laid on a wall that needed finishing before the next storm. Close to midnight, another article surfaced on a gossip site with a taste for moral theater. A source close to the family claimed Dorian only sought to protect assets from impulsive post-sale decisions. I recognized Marissa's phrasing immediately, her trademark of moral varnish over control. I told myself that tomorrow in court I wouldn't argue emotion. I'd let the numbers and the witnesses do the talking. The night before the hearing, Calder came to my house with a thick binder. We rehearsed in the living room as if it were a courtroom. He played the opposing counsel sharp, unrelenting. "Why didn't you go to the police immediately after the restaurant incident?" he asked. "Because I wanted the evidence sealed first," I answered. "The sample, the witness, the lab report, everything aligned before accusation. A misstep gives them an escape." He asked why I moved my assets into a trust. I said, to protect them post-merger, and the conditions only trigger with proof of manipulation or crime. He nodded, noting the rhythm of my delivery like a conductor testing tempo. When he left, the rain began soft, granular, like someone sieving sand over the roof. I turned off most of the lights, leaving only the porch and the kitchen lamp. On the counter sat Eleanor's old kettle, dark and steady in its place. The chipped ceramic cup beside it gleamed faintly under the light, the handle smooth from years of habit. The next morning, new headlines rolled in. Dorian had posted on social media, urging respect for privacy, saying he'd do what's best for the family. I read every word, each one a carefully painted door with a broken handle. I gathered my files, the lab report, the recordings on a read-only drive, the spending chart, Julian's affidavit from the Silver Palm. Outside, dusk was already falling. I locked the windows, checked the gate, and sat at my desk as the yellow lamp draped its quiet warmth across the wood. The phone buzzed. A text from Dorian. Same name, same contact position in my phone. It said only, "I just want it to be fair." I stared at the screen for a long time. No reply came to mind, only the sound of rain tapping steady over the oak leaves outside. The courthouse was cool that morning, the kind of air that smells faintly of polish and paper. My shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing off the stone like a metronome, keeping time with my pulse. Outside the courtroom, Calder gave me a slow, steady nod. Seraphine stood a few paces back, clutching her case file, her expression precise, every movement neat as a drawn line. Inside, the clock above the bench ticked past 8:30. Judge Rowena Hale entered from chambers, her black robe crisp, her voice even as the clerk read the case title. The overhead lights cast a neutral wash across both tables. No warmth, no bias. I sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded on the surface just as Calder had drilled. Across from me, Dorian sat, rigid fingers interlaced on his knees. Marissa kept her gaze low, a strand of hair slipping from its clip like a misplaced comma. Julian Cross was called first. He took the oath spine, straight shoulders square, the posture of someone who'd rehearsed his courage. Calder began with short questions, just enough to frame the scene. Julian described the night at the Silver Palm, the candlelight glinting off the wine glass, the order of the table settings the moment I stepped away to answer a call. His tone was calm, methodical. Sometimes he paused, eyes narrowing slightly, as if aligning an old key with a familiar lock. He told the court how, while I was gone, he noticed a subtle motion, Marissa's hand brushing the rim of my glass, a gesture quick and contained, and how Dorian called him over a second later to ask about an appetizer, drawing attention away. Then softly but firmly, he said, "I once watched my father get poisoned in a small-town diner when I was a boy." I couldn't stay silent again. The room inhaled sharply, then held its breath. The court reporter's keys filled the silence, the sound like a soft, constant rain. The defense attorney rose. Her tone began gentle, then tightened. She asked about lighting distance perception. She questioned whether trauma had colored his memory. Julian didn't waver. He said he'd spent over 10 years in fine dining, trained to observe, to distinguish the difference between a pour and an addition. When asked if he'd been paid by me, he said no. I only received the tip any server earns when a guest believes you may have just saved their life. Next came Dr. May Holloway, white coat over a pale gray blazer, her hair pulled back, her eyes clear behind thin frames. She presented the toxicology findings from the sealed sample, the diazepam concentration, its correlation with Dorian's symptoms, the metabolic window. Her testimony was steady, clinical, unflinching. When the defense asked whether the drug could have come from another source, she replied that Dorian's medical file showed no prescription, that the trace matched oral ingestion, and that the wine sample aligned with what was found in his bloodstream. No excess words. No air left for doubt. Calder requested to play the footage from my home's security system. He submitted the consent form, the Texas statute, allowing common area surveillance and the digital forensic certification. The projection screen lowered. The lights dimmed. The video rolled, no audio. My dining room appeared on screen. Dorian and Marissa sitting close elbows on the table, papers spread between them, a pen rolling across the surface. Dorian leaning in, Marissa whispering something. The timestamp matched the evening after our dinner, the same hour I'd written in my notes. The defense objected to the lack of sound. Calder responded by submitting the verified audio transcript and forensic report confirming frame-to-sound synchronization. Judge Hale skimmed the papers, asked 2 procedural questions, then nodded. "You may play the relevant portion." The speakers clicked alive. First came the small sounds paper against wood, a breath caught halfway. Then Marissa's voice, low but clear, speaking of management order convenience. Dorian's voice followed, uncertain, mentioning old debts, saying things could go back to normal if I'd just agree to sign. Then came the question that silenced the air. What if he doesn't agree? And Marissa's reply, soft as silk, sharp as a blade, talk of medical evaluations, mental decline, a doctor willing to write what needed to be written. A pen tapped the edge of a glass. At the end came her final words, crisp, deliberate. "Once he signs, it's all ours." The courtroom froze. It was as if someone had shut off the sound of the world. Dorian's shoulders twitched. Marissa's hand flew to her cheek. Tears rising fast, but too late to hide the panic in her eyes. The defense jumped up, demanding the statement be struck as out of context. Judge Hale ordered an extended playback, 3 minutes before 2, after. The screen filled with more of the same talk of the power of attorney, of signing, of arranging the assets of a medical form ready to go. No one in that room needed an interpreter. Calder didn't linger. He moved to the financial exhibits, blown-up charts of luxury purchases, subcard withdrawals, synced to the decline of Dorian's startup. Internal emails from his CFO tenure followed, showing unrevoked access credentials, server logs, confirming logins after termination. Each piece of paper slid into the narrative, like a gear locking into place. The defense tried another angle. They painted me as withdrawn after the company sale, cold, distant, a father who'd closed himself off. They called an old friend of Dorian's to reminisce about missed dinners and misunderstandings. I let it play. I sat still, hands folded, and let the story unravel on its own weight. When Calder brought the evidence back to the timeline, the data, the traceable truth. Judge Hale stayed steady, cutting off repetition, steering both sides to specifics. Her gavel barely needed to rise. Each tap marked a boundary, not a blow. Then came my turn. Calder guided me through the points. Short prompts, deliberate pacing. I recounted that night at the restaurant, why I didn't drink, why I switched the glasses, why I submitted the sample to the lab and attorney before contacting authorities. I explained the cameras, the trust, the clause protecting assets in case of coercion. I said the document had been signed under full capacity, witnessed, certified by my physician. When I mentioned Eleanor, it wasn't for pity, it was anchor. I said her name simply as if pointing to the foundation beneath everything we built. The defense asked if I still loved my son, if this was all just a misunderstanding. I didn't argue. I said love was one matter, protection from conspiracy was another, and that the court was here to judge the second, not the first. Then I stopped, letting silence do the rest. At noon, the court recessed. When we reconvened, Judge Hale announced that the next session would focus on the legal admissibility of the electronic records and expert forensic testimony. The light filtering through the blinds softened the sharpness of the Texas sun. I felt sweat at my collar, gone in seconds under the hum of air conditioning. Dorian stared at his hands. Marissa turned away, her eyes rimmed red, her jaw tight. By the end of the session, Judge Hale scheduled the next morning for arguments regarding the temporary asset protection order and the restraining provisions. Her tone remained composed, but final. She reminded both parties to refrain from public comment overnight. Then the gavel struck once clean, decisive absolute. The final morning of the hearing broke under a sky so blue it looked carved from glass. I arrived at the courthouse an hour early and stood beneath the row of oaks along the plaza, watching people move past with coffee cups and folders, the scent of caffeine mixing with printer ink and humidity. In the breast pocket of my jacket was a folded scrap of paper, Eleanor's handwriting from an old letter. When a person does what's right, the wind will find its way to their side. I held it between my fingers until the clerk opened the courtroom doors. Inside, the air felt heavy, as if everyone had agreed to hold their breath at once. Dorian and Marissa were already seated close, but not touching. Calder slid a new folder in front of me. Dark blue, the summary of conclusions on top. When the session began, Judge Rowena Hale surveyed both tables. Her gaze carried no judgment, only inevitability. Her voice was calm, deliberate, each word measured like a nail struck clean. The power of attorney, she began, is hereby rendered void. The document, she explained, had been falsified, its notary seal forged, its language premeditated. Each sentence landed with the precision of a final hammer tap. Dorian lowered his head, fingers clasped tight. Marissa lifted hers, eyes swollen but still defiant. I kept my gaze on this pen resting in front of me, remembering the night I'd signed the blank copy, the signature that became their own undoing. Judge Hale continued financial exploitation of an elder substantiated. Evidence sufficient unauthorized access wire transfers and attempts to seize control of assets through fraudulent means. The room went silent, reverent, like a church after the hymn has ended. Somewhere behind me, a soft exhale. Maybe a journalist, maybe a stranger, who'd wandered in for spectacle and stayed for truth. Calder leaned toward me, his voice barely audible. "We've reached the edge of reason," he said. The judge moved on. Regarding the diazepam incident, the court acknowledged the presence of the substance, but per my signed declaration, no criminal referral would be made. My request had been simple. The truth is enough. I will not destroy my son to prove it. And so the court confined itself to civil judgment, full restitution, preservation of my assets, and transfer of protected holdings to the Eleanor Foundation for Integrity as stipulated in the irrevocable trust. A faint smile crossed Calder's face. Not joy, not triumph, just the quiet release of a man who's placed the final cornerstone. The defense attorney rose, a young woman with too much sympathy and too little ground asking leniency. She spoke of pressure of fear of the desperation that drives people to cross moral borders. Judge Hale listened, made a few notes, then lifted her head. Her tone softened, but her words carried the clean edge of law. "Dorian Merrin," she said, "is prohibited from business management or fiduciary authority for 5 years with a 2-year suspended sentence and 400 hours of community service. Marissa Merrin, as accomplice, receives the same suspension and mandatory enrollment in financial rehabilitation programs." I turned slightly. Dorian remained bowed. Marissa's tears fell fast, as if she wished to outrun the years that had brought her here. Only the clacking of the clerk's keys filled the air, now a kind of rainstorm made of ink. Judge Hale removed her glasses, looked at me directly. "Justice isn't revenge, Mr. Merrin," she said. "It's clarity." The words hung in the air, clean and unadorned. I didn't rise. I just answered softly, "Sometimes clarity is redemption." She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then brought down the gavel. One strike dry, final, like the end of a long storm. When the room emptied, I stayed seated for a minute longer. The judgment lay before me, the name Eleanor Foundation for Integrity, printed in bold words I'd once written by hand on the first draft of the trust. Outside sunlight poured over the courtyard, white and sharp as salt. Reporters clustered by the steps, microphones poised. Calder moved ahead, blocking their questions with a quiet shake of his head. When one journalist caught my eye, I said only, "I believe in the law, and I hope someone learns something from all this." Then I walked on. At home, the wooden gate opened soundlessly. The lavender by the porch had bloomed right on schedule. The late afternoon sky was painted in amber and rose the kind of light Eleanor used to wait for, just to call it a day. On my desk, her photograph still sat by the window. Her face no longer a wound, just a calm river after rain. I took off my tie, hung my jacket, sat down. My hand rested on the smooth wood of the desk. I thought of Dorian, of the years ahead. He'd have to live with the mirror of his choices. Justice, I realized, wasn't about punishment. It was a mirror polished until it reflected everything, even the eyes that once refused to look. And I believed one day he'd find the courage to face it. The summer that followed, I lived in a small cedar cabin by Lake Travis, half an hour west of Austin, though it felt like another world entirely. In the early mornings, the lake lay still as glass sunlight spreading across its surface like molten copper. I woke when the kingfishers began. Their dives brewed strong coffee and leaned against the porch rail, listening to the hiss of mist rising off the water and the distant hum of fishing boats drifting out toward open light. The cabin had once belonged to an older couple who'd retired to Florida. It was small but airtight, with a stone fireplace, a few shelves lined with books, and a long oak table I'd built myself from salvaged boards. On the wall hung only two things: our wedding photo and a framed letter from the Eleanor Foundation for Integrity. Every quarter, I still read through the Foundation's reports, not to oversee anything but the way someone might reread an old journal entry that reminds them they were once right about something. That afternoon, a soft wind came off the lake, fluttering the curtains. I was sorting through paperwork when I heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel. The mail carrier waved, smiling. "Got one from Washington for you, Mr. Merrin." I thanked him, signed, and sat down at the oak table. The envelope was thick, the kind that carried official ink and sincerity. Inside was a letter from the National Council for Elder Protection. The first line said they wanted to thank me. My case, they wrote, had helped hundreds avoid emotional and financial ruin. They were now using it as a training example for new social workers. At the bottom was the director's signature, and beneath it, a handwritten note. "Thank you for choosing to stand, not for revenge, but to bring light to the corners where silence used to live." I sat still for a long while, my finger resting on the spot where the ink hadn't fully dried. Outside, the lake mirrored a flawless blue sky. Two ducks glided side by side through a band of pale gold. In that moment, every sound in my head quieted, as if someone had laid a blanket over a restless child. I folded the letter, set it beside my cold cup of coffee, and whispered, "I didn't win against anyone. I just stopped letting people hurt me." The next morning was clear, the sunlight flashing across the porch like liquid glass. I poured coffee and stepped outside. The lake burned bright under the rising sun. For a moment I thought of Dorian, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. I knew he was in his second year of probation, working at a disability support center near Dallas, filing his monthly reports with the oversight board. Maybe in time he'd learn what I had taken too long to see. People don't lose because they're robbed. They lose because they give trust to the wrong hands. I wished someone had told me that when I was 35, back when I still believed family was a structure you could lean on forever. I sat on the porch chair, the mug warm in my hands, steam curling into the thin morning fog. Every morning here felt the same, yet never empty. In that rhythm of stillness, I found the freedom I'd chased half my life through: contracts, figures, and promises. Now there was only one commitment left worth keeping, to live the rest of my days honest with myself. I left the cabin while the sun was still soft on the water, slipped a sprig of lavender into my jacket pocket, and drove toward the small cemetery on the western hill outside Austin. The road wound through old oaks, their roots pushing up through the damp soil. The air smelled of rain and earth. I parked beneath a tall cypress, carrying a small bottle of water and a soft brush. Eleanor's headstone lay in a patch of sun filtered through the leaves. Her name was carved deep into pale stone. Her birth and death years standing like two wave marks, holding a long, silent tide between them. I told her about the foundation that bore her name, how this quarter we'd approved 2 more cases, bringing the total to 12 families, saved from forged signatures and financial deceit. There was a retired carpenter in Lubbock, widowed, nearly tricked by a nephew into signing away his home. And an old schoolteacher in San Marcos, coaxed by her son-in-law to mortgage her pension for some investment no one could explain. Each case arrived like a scar in a ledger of trust, but I'd seen their eyes after the knots were untied, the kind of peace that feels like sunlight falling through a kitchen window at dusk. A light breeze came off the hill, carrying the lavender's dry sweetness. I told Eleanor that Dorian had left Texas, moved to Colorado early in the spring. He worked now in a small repair shop on the edge of Boulder, fixing snowblowers, lawnmowers, and old pickup trucks. The shop sat beside an empty lot, with the front range rising behind it, like a green-gray wall. I knew these details from the court's supervision reports, and from a short note Calder had passed along. His wages were being garnished under the restitution order, slow payments, steady. We hadn't spoken, but once I'd seen his name on a local charity donor list, $15, then $30 to an animal rescue group. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe a new habit forming one that had nothing to do with my money. I poured the rest of the water over the grass, wiped the stone clean with a cloth. For a moment, Marissa's face flickered in my mind the way she looked around the courtroom when the recording played, her eyes like a glass quietly breaking. I no longer carried vengeance for anyone. I'd seen greed burn its own house down. The court had done its part. I'd done mine. The rest would belong to time. Before leaving, I told Eleanor one more story. A 70-year-old woman in El Paso, a retired teacher, whose son had forced her to sign a loan to buy a luxury car. Our field officer arrived just in time, connected her with a community legal group, blocked the transaction, returned the car to the dealership. The son was ordered into a mandatory financial counseling program. I told Eleanor that each time a bad deal was stopped, it felt like pulling a small thorn out of skin, stretched too tight. And somewhere I hoped she smiled, not for the victory, but for the wound that never had to form. Walking back down the hill, I turned once more before getting into the car. The road to Lake Travis opened wide beneath the sinking sun streaks of light cutting through the oaks. By the time I reached the cabin, the lake had turned deep blue. I set a chair out on the porch and watched the ridgelines fade into the horizon. Inside, I wasn't counting gains or losses anymore, only the spaces between light and shadow passing like breaths. If someone were to ask what I'd learned from all these years, I'd tell them this trust is a garden that needs guarding. Maturity is knowing when to lock the gate. And love, real love, is stopping your own hand before you make yourself bleed. Thank you for listening. That's the end of my story. If you believe justice doesn't need to shout, share this story, like the video, and subscribe, because sometimes silence is the strongest voice of all.